Hi, everybody, and welcome to this UK and Changing Europe Lunch Hour. I am Jill Rutter, a Senior Fellow at UK and Changing Europe in the Institute for Government, and I am in Manchester at the Conservative Party conference. So currently I am in the highly recommended Ibis Styles Hotel, very conveniently located for the conference centre. So we're going to be reflecting on the state of the right after two big right party conferences, the Conservatives, and a couple of weeks back, the Reform Party conference. As he said, like other party conferences, reform is very high up on everyone else's agenda as well as their own. So to do that and to reflect on the state of the right, I am joined by a fantastically expert panel. I have our two former deputy directors of UK and a Changing Europe, Professor Paula Surridge from the University of Bristol, Professor Tim Bale from the Queen Mary's London. Both of them are co-authors, along with others as well, I think, of the soon-to-be published study on the 2024 general election. And Tim, of course, is the author of the Conservative Party after Brexit, and so very well placed to comment on that. And I'm delighted that we're also joined by Tim Montgomery. Tim, founder of Conservative Home, very notable, possibly the most recognised mover from the Conservatives to Reform. And I do know that Nadine Dorris and Danny Kruger have also made that move, but also a participant in one of my every week must listen podcasts, Not Another One, which I would highly recommend if you want different voices reflecting on political issues of the day. So we're going to reflect on the state of the right, but we of course want your questions, so please post them in Slido. And to make my life easier, not least because I'm doing this from a minute laptop, could you upvote the questions you really like, even if they're not quite as good as the way you would have put it, and then we will pepper our superb panel with all your questions, and we will finish at 2 o'clock. So you can get back to the Conservative Party conference, that's where you're at, or you can get back to the day job if you're not. So Paula, I wanted to start with you. This time last year, at Conservative Party conference, I thought the Conservatives were surprisingly upbeat. The members seemed a bit liberated by not being in government anymore. And the members were energised by being actually having a role in the leadership contest, which gave us Kemi Badenoch as leader. And I thought, intriguingly, the biggest claplines at events were when people said voters did not vote for Labour, they voted to get rid of us, which seemed to attract a lot of applause whenever Michael Gove said it, which he did quite a lot. So I wondered, just a year on, how are things looking for the Conservative Party? I think we've just had quite an interesting poll out this morning, which shows them level pegging with the Liberal Democrats. Have they reached rock bottom? Where are the Conservatives going?
Well, I think in terms of contrasting with last year, they've obviously slipped further in the polls since this time last year. So I guess the membership and the wider party can see that this hasn't been a quick fix. It wasn't a case of the electorate getting rid of them and then, oh, well, we got rid of them, that's fine, and then kind of turning things around. And I don't know why they would ever have thought that would happen. If we look at how the electorate responded to the Labour government when they left office, it took a very, very long time for that reputation to be rebuilt. So I'm not quite sure why the Conservatives expected theirs to be a quick turnaround. The poll you're talking about today, the most recent YouGov poll, shows Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats at 17% of the vote. But we know from the last election that the Liberal Democrats vote share doesn't necessarily reflect where they're really at, given that their vote is quite concentrated in particular parts of the country. So they could actually be doing much better than they were in 2024, and yet they don't seem to be something that the Conservatives are too concerned about just now. I noticed John Curtis had made some comments yesterday that they might be on the same vote share, but the Conservative vote share is spread very evenly all across the country, and that's not a good recipe in a first-past-the-post system. So on the same vote share, we might expect the Lib Dems to end up with more seats.
And if we're looking at Reform has been consistently leading polls for the last few months at the very least, if not. Have they reached their ceiling? Is there a lot of more upside potential for reform, or are we thinking 30% and not much more?
Was that one also to me, Jill?
Yeah, to you, Paula, yeah.
So the reform vote share is going up most where it is eating up Conservative vote share. So while there is still Conservative vote share for reform to eat up, the potential for their ceiling could still be a little bit higher because they could still eat a bit more of their vote. But I think probably we are starting to get towards the peak of that when we're starting to get towards 35%, which some of the pollsters are showing, but most of them aren't getting figures quite as high as that at the moment. But as long as there's still Conservative leaning voters that they can pull into their camp, it could still go higher. If the Conservatives have a spectacular conference, maybe that will win some of those voters back and they could go lower. But I don't know. You're the ones in Manchester. You can tell me whether it's been spectacular or not. From a distance, it doesn't look very spectacular.
Well, Tim, one of the sort of comments that quite a few people, Tim Bale, she said, I realise I have two Tims, quite a lot of people making is that the Conservative Party conference, you're not here, sort of feels a bit empty. There's some very, snarky comments about, does it feel a bit like a wake? Is the Conservative in an existential crisis? Somebody's made, something of a recent career out of studying the Conservative Party. Are you worried that you're about to look at something that's got built-in obsolescence and it's about to be overtaken? Don't worry, Tim Montgomery, I'll ask you to comment on this as well.
My business model is bust. Possibly, but I guess it would be interesting to write a book about the death of a party. I'm normally rather skeptical when people start banding around the E word, existential, but it really does look quite serious for the Conservatives now. I mean, they have been in very deep holes before, as we know. I mean, 45, for example, even 1997 you can point to. But the big difference this time, and this is of course where the other Tim comes in, is that they face a threat on their right flank, and that's something really that they've never had to face before. And I think Paul is absolutely right to say after a big election defeat, no one would normally expect a party to come back very quickly. Indeed, what Keir Starmer and Labour managed to do after 2019 was highly unusual. So the Conservatives could normally, albeit slightly depressingly, have thought, well, we might be out for a couple of parliaments, maybe three, but we'll get back in after that. But that was, of course, in the absence of any particular presence on their right. This time, that's not true. So they have to try and recover as quickly as possible, lest they do get overtaken and surpassed. And in some ways, what happens to them ends up being a repeat of what happened to the Liberals back in the 1920s.
Kemi Badenoch came leader and said she wasn't going to rush into lots of policy, but we have actually seen what people are describing as quite a policy-rich conference. We've had some sort of quite notable statements, whether it's on looking again, repealing, reforming the Climate Change Act, whether it's withdrawal from the ECHR, Mel Stride announcing sort of, potential 47 billion worth of cuts. Do you understand the sort of policy strategy that is underpinning where the Conservatives are setting them? We've got all of the Manchester Conference Hall has this sort of slogan of stronger economy, stronger borders. That's the sort of message you get as you walk into the conference hall and wherever you look. Does that strike you as a message that will appeal and help them rebuild some of the coalition that brought them to power?
Well, I think it's an understandable message given their analysis of what happened at the election, in the sense that they do believe very strongly, rightly or wrongly, that they lost a lot of votes because of their unfulfilled promises on migration. And clearly they lost quite a lot of votes because they never managed really to restore prosperity after the global financial crisis and the period of austerity. I think it's forgetting, however, that actually there were other reasons they lost the election, in particular the dire state of public services. And it was very interesting listening to Kemi Badenoch's first speech that she didn't mention the NHS once, But if you look at people's opinions during the election and after the election, that was actually quite an important issue for voters. I mean, it does seem to me, and I'm not the only one saying this, obviously, that a lot of what they're doing right now is chasing after reform. I would say that's probably a misconceived strategy based not only on where their polling is right now, and you could argue they've been doing that for a few months now. But also, if you look at centre-right parties all over Europe, that's something that they have tried to do to counter the populist radical right, to offer, if you like, a dilute version of what populist radical right parties are themselves offering. And it tends either to be futile or positively counterproductive, in the sense that it forces them to start talking about issues which essentially play very, very well for those populist radical right parties. So I wouldn't do what they're doing, but I can understand why they're doing it.
So, Tim, you are probably the target of much of this. So would you like to just tell us what made you decide, after life in the Conservative Party, to go to reform? And is Kemi Badenoch and her team doing anything at this conference to tempt you back?
Well, first of all, Jill, thank you very much for having me. I would say it's been really hard the last few days, actually. I've been here for 48 hours in Manchester now, and everyone is being so nice to me. It would be much more difficult if people were being rude or sort of angry with me. But the question they keep sort of saying after they say, "Oh, sorry to see you go and nice to have you here," etc., is, "We think you'll be back soon." Probably half of the 200 people I've spoken to over the last couple of days have said, "You'll be back soon." And that, for me, sort of underlines a party in denial. I'm not coming back. I'm not going back to the Conservative Party. I left, to answer your question directly, because the Conservative Party, which promised to control immigration, lost control of Britain's borders. The promise to control taxation saw taxation rise. The party of home ownership saw home ownership fall. The party is supposedly of common sense values saw wokery expand throughout your former manor, Jill, in Whitehall. The Conservative Party didn't behave in government like a Conservative Party. And you call this party conference policy rich, and you're right. But what the Conservative Party hasn't answered, and it's why I feel I have no inclination to go back, is it's a bit like, this is an analogy I sort of use, is I know, Jill, we sold you that car and the wheels fell off on the motorway last time, but we've got another one for you, another car with 4 wheels. Will you buy it for us this time? Without explaining to you why the car failed so catastrophically last time. And the Conservative Party, I don't think, really has come to terms with the fact that, why did they fail so comprehensively? I can remember, I'm old enough to remember the 18 years of Thatcher Major governments between 79 and 97. You may not have liked what they did, but they definitely did what they said they were going to do. They transformed the country. Whereas the last 14 years of Conservative government have been all over the place in terms of prime ministers, all over the place in terms of delivery. And I have a lot of sympathy with what the other Tim says about it's going to take a little while or a long while for the Conservative Party to sort of even be given a hearing again, for the people to actually say, okay, you've done your porridge, we are willing to, give you another look. Because the failure was so comprehensive, the Conservative Party, the idea that the Conservative Party could spring back into a position of public esteem is just for the birds, I think. And Kemi Badenoch, I don't know whether you've noticed, the last sort of 24 hours, she's sort of been more rosy and more friendly in interviews. The stern, frowning Kemi Badenoch seems to be on the back seat, which is a good thing. And I prefer the sort of more friendly Kemi Badenoch. But these are sort of twists, gentle turns of the dial. They don't really address the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem why the Conservative Party is in the mess that it is.
And are there people at this conference, Tim, who are coming up to you and saying, I'm quite reform curious, I'm quite tempted, what's it like over there? And does reform just want to become, clearly a refuge for Conservative voters, but does it really want to just be a refuge for slightly desperate Conservative MPs, former MPs, who might say, actually, I don't see much chance of a way back at the next election if I stand with a Conservative flag? But maybe if I go Reform, I could get back into Parliament. Actually, they're not that different to us, really. So why don't I just give it a go and, go Team Farage rather than Team Kemi?
Yeah. Well, actually, I've had very few people say that to me in Manchester, to be honest. I get about 4 or 5 calls most days, though, from Conservatives asking me about what's it like, the sort of questions you've just said to me. And perhaps they don't want to say them in Manchester ask the questions in Manchester in case they're overheard. These are just ordinary members, there's a few MPs. But a little bit back to what Paula was explaining to you a few minutes ago about where and how high the Reform vote can go. I've spoken to Nigel Farage about this. I think we're getting to a point where we have to analyse as a party whether defections are very useful for us. If you're going to be the party that says you're the alternative to the Unity Party, the alternative to the existing parties, when you keep taking sort of former Tory insiders into your fold, are you diluting that brand? And I think Nigel is thinking it very actively about that at the moment. I think there are particular skill sets that the Reform needs to prove that they're a government in waiting, which means that there's certain people that I think we would welcome. But actually, I think we're getting to the point where more Tory defections don't necessarily serve the party's interests. And, where Reform can really start to move the electoral map in Wales, in the red wall seats of the north, in Scotland, particularly in the next sort of 12 months. That's sort of parts of the country where the Tories are toxic. The Tories are not going to recover in those areas. So more Tory defections actually dilutes where I think Reform need to go. I don't know whether we can get up to 35% and beyond. I hope we can, but it won't be on the back of more Tory defections. It will be about presenting ourselves as a very different kind of party than what people have seen previously.
And Paula, the focus at this conference has been very much, if you like, sort of, reform, but with fiscal responsibility, reform like policies on migration and culture, following some of the reform agenda setting there, I think it would be fair to say. But they're fiscally irresponsible. So, reform plus austerity. The Conservatives don't seem to be bothering at all to rethink their appeal to people who potentially might vote Liberal Democrat at an election, and yet we saw them lose a lot of seats in the south, sort of home counties, to Liberal Democrats. Do you think they're giving up on what someone described as a sort of professional managerial class? I think it might have been Ben Ansell last week. Are they just giving up on those voters? I went to a Conservative Forum for Europe, Conservative Europe Forum. They used to be the Conservative Group for Europe, and they've renamed themselves. And Andy Street was there, who's has managed to appeal to quite a lot of people when he was mayor of the West Midlands. And I asked a question about whether they saw any prospect that they might influence their party back towards their way of thinking. And he said, well, yes, economic reality will force people to rethink some of these things and force them back to be more pro-European and whatever. Do you see any signs that the party is trying to broaden its appeal in that direction? And is that a risk that they don't?
There's no sign at all of them attempting to do that. The policy announcements that you've been talking about on, the European Court of Human Rights, on migration, on climate change, they're not making any attempt at all to win back those voters that may have gone to the Lib Dems last time around, or some of them stuck with the Conservatives last time around and have defected and are looking at other parties now. Maybe they don't know, or they're thinking about the Liberal Democrats. But at the same time, they are putting in place this kind of continued austerity and so on, which doesn't necessarily play well to some of the voters that have gone to Reform either. Because if we look at where those Reform voters are, rather than the councillors and the party members, where the reform voters are, they're largely coming from the economic left. So yes, they want to see all these policies on immigration and so on, but they don't want to see austerity, and they don't want to see public services further cut and so on. So the Conservatives are really ending up in the worst of all worlds, in that they're not holding on to the voters that they did manage to keep in 2024, that didn't go to the Lib Dems, that might have held on, and they're not going to win back the reform voters either, because the reform voters don't necessarily like this particular package of economic policies either. So they're just ending up in the worst of all worlds.
Tim Bale, do you want to come in on that? Tim, unmute. Tim, still unmute.
I think Paula's got a point, although I think we need to be a little bit careful when we suggest that all reform voters are necessarily particularly, if you like, left wing, although I do take the point that they are quite concerned about public services, just as many people are. I think it is quite extraordinary that the Conservatives lost so many seats to the Lib Dems and yet don't seem to be thinking in terms of trying to get those people back. I guess some of the things that Mel Stride has announced at the conference, which do go back, if you like, to more classically conservative, sort of economically liberal policies, if you like, might be an attempt to do that. And, you know, there might be some success there in the long term, or the medium term anyway, if Labour carries on, in the Conservatives' view, mismanaging the economy and the public finances in the way that they are. But I do agree with Paula that in some senses they are in the worst of all worlds, sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't, because everything that they do to try and play catch up with reform will put off those Lib Dem defectors, if you like. And a lot of what they might do to try and encourage some of those Lib Dem defectors back may put off some who have moved over to reform. So it really is a very unenviable position for the Conservatives. I think it's not obviously just about policies, though, because very few people will actually be paying any attention to what the Conservatives are suggesting or promising to do, partly because they are fed up with the Conservatives after 14 years in power, partly because they don't think the Conservatives have got much chance of getting into government next time around, and partly because people don't follow politics that closely anyway. But what they do have some sense of, I guess, is who's leading the party. But even there, polling suggests that many voters don't really know who Kemi Badenoch is, don't really know what she stands for, and of those who do, they're not very impressed either. So hence all the speculation, although it's dampened down a little bit, but I suggest it will come back after November the 3rd, when she's eligible for, as it were, a no confidence vote about the leadership of the party.
So Tim Bale again, you had to sort of keep on making more space on your cover as another Conservative Prime Minister was added while you were writing it. Do we think Kemi Badenoch will face a leadership challenge November or next May? And is there anyone that people are talking about? Robert Jenrick, got a question about that. Katie Lamb, some people have been mentioning as skipping another generation, be making some waves here. Boris Johnson as the sort of king over the water, the sort of Andy Burnham-y sort of figure, not in Parliament, but still around. Is there anyone who could make a difference to Conservative fortunes?
I doubt it at the moment. I mean, I think they probably made the wrong decision last year when they picked Kemi Badenoch. And I think as a result of people playing games in the leadership contest, James Cleverly didn't make it into the final two. I think he might have been a better pick in the sense of giving the party more of a kind of relatable leader. I think Jenrick is the obvious front runner at the moment, although James Cleverly might not like to hear that. I think he is equally problematic given, you know, what we've said about some of the downsides of the strategy that they are pursuing. It seems to me that he will try to, you know, quote unquote, out Farage or out reform, having exactly the same, you know, futile or counterproductive result as we've seen already. I think the one thing that you could say about Jenrick is that he does seem to be more open to the possibility of a deal or a pact with reform as we move closer to the election. I think he said today or yesterday that a pact was not a priority, and that certainly isn't ruling it out. I guess, if I were a Conservative and trying to think perhaps rationally in some ways about this issue, you might elect someone who you feel could do some kind of deal with Nigel Farage at the last minute, and perhaps save a few seats. Although at the moment, I think it's quite difficult to see the Conservatives getting into triple figures again. They were very worried about actually falling below 100 in 2024. It looks very much now as if they might fall under 100 next time around. Boris Johnson, I mean, he's always the kind of break glass in case of emergency candidate for the Conservatives, but I think you can only pull off that trick once. And certainly if you look at people who've defected to reform, I think Paula will back me up on this. They're not big fans of Boris Johnson. They were, but they were extremely disillusioned with him after Partygate.
Tim Montgomery, I don't know whether you want to give any advice to your former party on where they might go. We've got one question about should the Tories opt for a moderate leader next time round? I don't know whether that's James Cleverly or people even more moderate than James Cleverly. But if you're looking and is reform in the market for a pact? The thing everybody's saying about Nigel Farage is basically wants to take over, wants to displace the Conservative Party, doesn't want to just absorb it or do a deal with it, particularly presuming a deal in which they at least would assume he would be the junior partner rather than the reverse.
I think the Conservative Party's problem is, I've been talking to sort of people close to Jenrick in recent days, and their sort of thinking is, there's no enthusiasm to take over the leadership. They say, the proposition of taking over the Conservative Party last year, when the Conservative Party was 10% ahead of reform, is a very different proposition from taking over now, when the Conservative Party is 15% behind reform. And so they're thinking, why take over the Conservative Party now, when you've got next May's local elections, which could be disastrous for the Conservative Party. And so the new leader owns what will be some of the worst Conservative Party local election results in history. The problem with that analysis is, if the Conservative Party doesn't start to change the weather soon, will there be much of the Conservative Party left? And some people ask me, why is Nigel Farage campaigning as if the general election is the week next Tuesday, when actually it's 3 years away? Well, the reason is because this period in this parliament so early, and I'm sorry to all those people watching who hate the idea of constant politics, but the reason why the campaigning is so intense is the battle now is for the ascendancy on the right. Which party is going to be the dominant party on the right? And so May's local elections next year could not be important. This is Reform's attempt to knock the Conservative Party out of the game. So for the Jenrickites to think, well, actually, is it worth having leadership now? Well, maybe not. But is it going to be worth anything at all after next May? And so back to the final or second part of your question, Jill. No, Nigel Farage is not interested in a deal with the Conservative Party at all. And sort of slightly to repeat myself, there is no advantage for reform in Wales, in the Red Wall, in Scotland, which also, we've got the Welsh Assembly, Welsh Parliament and the Scottish parliamentary elections next year. There is no advantage for reform in any time in the near future of any kind of deal. The maximalist deal that I could foresee would be just where close to an election, Reform don't put much resources into seats where there are sitting Conservative MPs in the sort of the blue wall seats. But other than that, there really is no advantage for Reform in doing any deal with the Conservative Party.
And we sort of look on Reform as sort of, inexorable rise of Reform. But what about some of Reform's vulnerabilities? If we look, we've had questions coming in about Nathan Gill in Wales and Russia links. There's always been some question marks about, are people a bit too soft on Putin? Nigel Farage, buying into the narrative on Ukraine. I thought it was really odd. I don't know whether you did, Tim, that Nigel Farage went to Washington and seemed to denounce the UK and suggest the US should impose trade sanctions. It didn't seem like the act of a great patriot. We now have reform stacking up with a bit of a track record in government, and very interesting things coming out of the Kent Council saying, actually, we've taken over from Conservatives. There isn't actually a fat to be cut, so we're going to have to shove up council tax, and by the next election there will probably be quite a number of reform councils. We've also seen that, while there's still 5 reform MPs, there are a different bunch of the 5 reform MPs from the ones that were elected, because whatever. And Nigel Farage has a bit of a track record that he doesn't hang on to people that easily. So, are you worried about those vulnerabilities, meaning perhaps that by the next election, reform will actually have, peaked and then deflated, if you like, on the sort of balloon? And I'll come to Paula and Tim about whether they think there are vulnerabilities there on the reform side.
Well, we've got so many questions in there. I don't quite know where to.
There's a bit of a list, but
start.
Anyway, just throwing you in at the question. You might add to my list, Tim, if there are other areas you're worried about that you would be advising as a strategist they need to buttress down against.
Well, look, this is how I'll answer your question, and people can come back to me if they think I've dodged anything. What reform has to do to go from the number of MPs it has to be a government in waiting? No one has ever done that in British politics, ever. What we have to build is an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, I think if anyone is capable of doing it, it's Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage is, I think, the most successful politician, most effective politician of his generation. What he has never had to do before is what he has to do now. He set himself the task of winning a referendum on Brexit. He set himself. One thing he does do is he doesn't champion popular causes, which I think is one of the misconceptions of his time. People say he's always playing to the crowd. Actually, if you look at the 2 issues he's been most associated with in recent years, Brexit and net zero, perhaps immigration's the exception, but if you look at Brexit and net zero, he's actually been against the public tide of opinion. He's helped change and champion public opinion the other way. So I think he's got to show over 3 years that he can build a government in waiting. And I think you will see a different Nigel Farage emerge. And my way of answering your particular question about the ethical issues, Jill, is I think Nigel Farage gets far too little credit for policing the right. Tommy Robinson, he's always he's always thought that someone like Tommy Robinson is unacceptable. Ben Habib, who I used to think was quite a sensible person when I saw him on television, some of the people watching may remember him, he's gone completely loopy since he went outside of reform. He's embraced some really, pretty unattractive characters. Danny Finkelstein, no particular admirer of reform, has said that what Nigel Farage does on the right is something Jeremy Corbyn has never done on the left. Nigel Farage knows what's acceptable and not acceptable. And I, on the Russia thing in particular, I think that's one of the things you majored on. Nigel Farage supports Ukrainian membership of NATO. He has backed every single British arms shipment to Ukraine, backs all of British funding of the war in Ukraine. I think we're fortunate as a country to have all the major political parties on the side of Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. Yes, Nigel Farage has given a semi-explanation as to why he thought Russia was provoked, but that semi-explanation has not led to any policy difference between the main parties. And I think rather than Labour and the Tories trying to make mischief with Reform's position on Ukraine, they should celebrate the fact that all the parties are in the same place on the Ukraine war.
Tim, do you think there are any vulnerabilities there, or? And it's quite interesting that I was at a dinner last night, it was Chatham House, so I can't say who was saying things. One of the things people were saying was actually, reform is often seen as part of a sort of European populist movement. Well, we ought to acknowledge actually reform is very different. It's nowhere like the AFD or RN and people. It's in a very different place, a much more moderate party than those, far-right populists that we see in continental Europe?
Well, I think someone who's saying that doesn't know very much about continental Europe, to be honest. I mean, clearly, I'm not going to put Reform UK in the same box as the AFD or even Rassemblement, because they are pretty extreme versions of the far right in Europe. But, you know, it's perfectly possible to see continuities between populist radical right parties of the non-extreme, if you like, variety, those parties that don't come out of some sort of fascist or neo-Nazi underground, and Reform UK. I mean, I think on the question of vulnerabilities, there are a few. One is actually Nigel Farage. He's both their greatest asset and their greatest liability, because there are so many people who distrust him and who regard him as, just too radical for them, and wonder whether someone like that can be prime minister. That's one vulnerability. I mean, I don't pass comment on whether they're right to say that or not, but that's one vulnerability. Another vulnerability, I think Tim has already pointed to it in some ways, is that they've got to go from 0 to 60 in terms of forming a government, and that's going to be quite difficult. Not having very many experienced people is tricky, and it's all very well saying we can get candidates who will be able to reassure people, but candidate selection is often much more difficult than people think, and you won't necessarily get a flood of highly competent people coming forward. And I don't think Reform UK really wants to try and sort of flood the House of Lords with people to do the jobs either. So that's possibly another vulnerability. And then in policy terms, I mean, I think the Russia thing, I mean, it matters to some people. I'm less convinced that actually it matters to many people. But I do think there are some concerns about, for example, the party's attitude to the National Health Service, which of course Labour will particularly be keen to highlight and create a bruise that they can punch. Now, it's possible that with Zia Youssef doing policy and Danny Kruger's come over to do policy, that they might come up with something a little bit more convincing, but those are vulnerabilities. The other one that people talk about, I'm not so convinced makes much of a difference actually, and that's the performance of Reform UK in local councils. I'm just not sure that people are paying enough attention to that particular issue for it to make a difference. And to be honest, that's not really what reform is about anyway. It's a vibe as much as a kind of competence outfit.
That's quite interesting. Paula, I've got a question here on Slido about, we sort of think of, we've called this the state of the right. A couple of weeks ago, we did the future of the left. But someone's putting a question saying, actually, are left-right at all meaningful at the moment? We see some quite left-wing economic policies. I think Mel Stride yesterday was denouncing Nigel Farage as a semi-socialist because he wants to nationalise things and wants to spend money on things that Conservatives don't. Are we beyond left and right? Is that a meaningful characterisation anymore?
So can I just add some things to the vulnerabilities first?
Oh, sure, yeah, that would be great. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I just wanted to add two or three really quick comments. The first was on the Russia comments, and particularly actually the comments that Nigel Farage made about Ukraine during the election campaign, during the general election campaign. Now, notwithstanding everything that Tim said about policy, I completely take that on board, but there is some evidence that did generate a little bit of a polling hit in the last weeks of the campaign for reform. And some of those, even within reform that we spoke to, suggested that had some impact towards the end of the campaign. So notwithstanding the actual policy, those comments did put some people off, and so that is a vulnerability. I agree completely with Tim Bale on the track record in local government. Who knows, by then we might be talking about a track record in Welsh government as well. But I don't think it's going to make any difference, because you're going to be talking about a track record of reform in local, potentially in Senate government, against the track record of the government in Westminster. So you're always going to be able to play those two things off against each other. And probably, I mean, maybe the government are going to really turn things around in the next 3 years. But at the moment, I wouldn't want to play those two records off each other with the public. And finally, the vulnerability that neither of the two Tims mentioned is that at the moment there seems to be a real kind of motivation for reform voters. Reform voters love their party, will turn out and vote for their party in a way that we saw political scientists talk about party identity in the 1960s. We haven't seen that for parties for quite some time. We see it with reform voters at the moment. But I think the vulnerability is if we continue to see defections coming in from the Conservatives, that some of that shine wears off, and potentially some of those non-voters who have been turning out to vote in local elections that perhaps normally wouldn't, might go back to being non-voters, might just end up with a, plague on all your houses position again. So those are just the things I wanted to add on the vulnerabilities. The big question about left and right, I mean, God, I've been arguing about this for so long that I don't even quite know where to answer the question. We use them as shorthands and we understand them. It wouldn't make sense really here for us to be talking about, Labour versus the Conservatives, because that's not the world we're living in anymore. The election study team have talked instead about kind of Brexit blocks, that although we might not be completely dominated by Leave and Remain identities anymore, that we're largely speaking, Reform and the Conservatives are fighting over the Leave vote, and Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems, the SNP in Scotland are fighting over the Remain vote. So maybe that kind of block makes sense, but simple left-right divisions don't make sense. They don't help to explain why some of those Reform voters who may be really keen on stronger borders, really keen on leaving the European Court of Human Rights, but don't want to see austerity and a privatised health service and so on. So if we just lump them into left and right as single positions on a kind of continuum, we lose that nuance, and we need to think more about a space that's a bit more two-dimensional in terms of attitudes. Climate net zero doesn't easily fit into that left-right framework. There's lots of issues like that, but then there are still some issues that do. So I think we need to think with a bit more nuance than just straightforward left and right. But you can't have nuanced lunch hours, otherwise we'd have to have one every week. So you've got to have one. You've got to cut them up somehow.
I'll tell Alan that we can't have nuanced lunch hours. I'm sure he would not accept that. Tim Bale, one of the sort of themes that one of the questions here is, can the Conservatives re-establish themselves as the party of business? And there are other events here about, can the Conservatives appeal to younger voters, where there's a very big worry of the demographic implications of the Conservative voting bloc. And I think the average age at which you would more likely to become a Conservative voter is about 61 or something like that. So do you see any signs that the Conservatives are re-establishing their role as a party of business? They're rather lost owing to Brexit and that.
Well, I mean, I can certainly see from what I see of the conference from far away. I'm not there this year, that they are making big efforts to do that. And I think one interesting thing that not many people perhaps have spotted is that actually the Conservatives still are raking in donations at a higher rate than some of the other parties, which suggests that there are business people willing to throw good money after what might be bad. I guess. I mean, the Conservatives have always had a slightly ambiguous relationship with business, as Boris Johnson's famous expletive that I'm not going to repeat indicates. It depends partly on which business you're looking at. Manufacturing and exporting, for example, probably weren't too pleased with Brexit. Some in the city and the financial sector were more pleased with it. And I think Brexit has done some damage in that respect. As far as young people are concerned, I think it's going to be very, very difficult. You've had what amounts to a bung announced by Mel Stride yesterday to younger people to help them get onto the housing ladder. I think they've heard all that before. And you can have as much money as you like, but if house prices continue to rise and not enough houses are built, that's not really going to help them very much. And I think obviously the pursuit of some of these culturally more conservative policies on, woke, on the green agenda, on migration, etc., etc. They form a kind of complex of values and attitudes which are off-putting to quite a lot of young people. Not all young people, of course, but quite a lot of young people. So I think that's going to be extremely difficult for them to do. And then you look at their membership, which is, quite old. I mean, still, 40% of Conservative members are over 65. Obviously, party membership is a sort of a middle-aged and older person's game anyway, but that's not going to help them. That's a wasting asset. And indeed, I should say, if we're talking about some of the problems of the Conservative Party, one that I did forget, which is unforgivable given I do all this research on party members, and it's something obviously Tim is very expert on as well, having started Conservative Home, is that their membership is not only kind of older, but it's also less active, and it seems to be shrinking anecdotally. We're hearing that about a third of all members seem to have decided not to renew their membership, and some are positively leaving in order to go to Reform. And we could now be in a situation, I don't know the figures, the Conservative Party never released them, of course, you have to wonder why, that they actually might have fewer members than the Greens, who are now at 80,000 something. So, that's an issue. And on, if I can just get back very quick to the vulnerabilities of Reform. One thing where they're not vulnerable, actually, because they've had this big influx of people into the party, is in terms of members who are willing to get active and do stuff for the party, particularly online. Actually, I think the challenge for Reform will be to actually mobilise those people in particular constituencies, and that's why they're setting up branches everywhere. Because it's all very well having tons and tons of members, which clearly they have. I mean, I think it's up to sort of nearly 250,000 or something, but you do need them on the ground to canvass people, to pop leaflets through doors, etc., because we know in very close races that can make a difference.
257,000, Tim.
There we are.
And does it feel a very different dynamic, Tim Montgomery? Does the Reform membership feel very, very different from the Conservative membership?
I went to the Reform conference. I don't know whether any of you were at the Reform conference in Birmingham, but I'll tell you the biggest difference. I'll say one thing that's negative about my new party, but let me say something that's positive about them first. When I go to Conservative conferences, and this conference hasn't been an exception, the conversation I get is basically framed like this. If we do this or that, we could win that constituency back, or we could win that. It's very much a party that is a political election-winning project. I don't think it's an accident the party that perhaps was the most successful electoral machine in the Western world has fallen so far. I think politics took over it, and voters can smell that. I think they can smell a party that everything they do is calculated, and whether it's changing a leader or announcing a new policy, there's a smell to the Conservative Party that's negative. Whereas at Reform, the conversations I had, and I spent a lot of time talking to members, partly because the conference was overshadowed by Angela Rayner's resignation, so all the news people went away, and so we were left to our own devices. And the conversation is very much, I'm in Reform because we need to do this, not as an instrumental means to an end. We just got to control immigration. We've got to start, saving local institutions from, global corporations or whatever it is. The party is motivated to do stuff because they see their communities changing or whatever. And that is partly why I think those 250,000 plus members, they are very committed to the cause. They aren't, that's as Tim was saying, they aren't a membership that is there in name but not in reality. And so it's very active. What I did find, though, negatively, and I've talked about this, you were kind enough, Jill, earlier to mention the Not Another One podcast I do, and I talked about this on the podcast. There's 5 to 10% of the Reform membership that are pretty unsavoury. That views were expressed as I went round that I found very unattractive. I think Nigel Farage is very good. I've already stated this, at policing the core of Reform. There needs to be more. There needs to be more careful look at how people get to Reform conference and that. There needs to be some experience of who these people are before they're just allowed to turn up at Reform conference. I'm afraid there are some unsavoury elements, and Reform needs to police that more. I would say those unsavoury elements are in other parties as well. Labour had their own problem with anti-Semitism until very recently, but Reform needs to acknowledge it does have that problem in its ranks, and it needs to be policed much more intensively.
That's very interesting. Tim, how does Reform see its relationship with business? I mean, some of its policies are quite sort of, on behalf of the little person against corporate power, abuses of corporate power. But some of the people come out of a straight sort of Thatcherite heritage of let's, get rid of all this annoying red tape. Let's do this, let's do that. And I'm just sort of quite intrigued as to where you think that will land in terms maybe of another manifesto. Will we see Reform as a very, pro-business party, or will we see it as, more populist than that and sort of taking on business?
Was that to me or the other Tim?
To you, and then the other Tim, Tim M, and then Tim B if he wants to come in, and Paula if she wants to come in as well. Tim M first.
I was on a panel last night with Tim Shipman of The Spectator. I seem to be on too many Tims and Tory discussions. Look, I think it's a very mixed bag, Jill. And so take probably the two policies that Reform are most associated with: immigration and Brexit, immigration and net zero. The control of immigration is not a policy that most business like. British business has benefited hugely from cheap labour for a long time. I think Reform need to get to the position whereby they're clear that high-skilled labour can still come in. It's not we have a policy of a net immigration being zero, not no immigration at all. That needs to be better communicated. The net zero on climate change policy, there are an awful lot of big businesses that have milked sort of green subsidy, and they don't like where we stand on that policy. But overall, one of the biggest problems British industry faces is we have the most expensive energy in the world, in the developed world. We've seen our manufacturing industry exported to other parts of the world. We sort of say as a country, we've done brilliant at meeting climate change targets. Well, we've only met our climate change targets by exporting our manufacturing industry to other parts of the planet. If you look at what we're actually consuming in terms of planetary resources, we haven't made anywhere near the same level of progress. So I think there are mixed signals to industry, but I think the overall policy direction is right, whatever it means for our support for business.
Tim Bale, what do you think? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the climate change issue is quite an interesting one. I think a lot of business would worry about some kind of rowback on the part of any government because they are beginning to invest in, what for good or ill is called the green transition. So I think business would have some concerns about that. I think clearly Reform is going to have to get its ducks in a row on the economy anyway. It can't go into an election in the way that some of its local council candidates have gone into, their election, promising all sorts of, magic money tree type cuts, only to find that in fact it's much more difficult to do. It's all very well, saying that Rachel Reeves is hemmed in by the bond markets and, Liz Truss suffered at the hands of the bond markets, but a Reform government would suffer at the hands of the bond markets unless they get that straight as well. So I think there are some concerns there.
Paula, do you think that, Reform will eat away at more of what used to be Conservative votes, sort of, business, small business people, things like that? Do you think it's got a sort of pro-business stance? Can it do that? Should the Conservatives be worried?
It's interesting that you bring up the kind of small business, because when we start to look at kind of occupational classifications of voters, that group that brings out small business owners have been quite distinctive in terms of their political opinions and voting behaviour. And they are where both the Conservatives and Reform had significant strength in 2024. So actually the battle over that we hear lots of talk about the battle for the working class vote, but the battle for that small business vote might well be quite crucial in terms of the relative balance between Reform and the Conservatives at the next election. So I don't feel at all qualified to comment on Reform's policy in that area, but that is a group of voters that both parties would do well to think more about.
That's very interesting. I want to come to a question about the electoral system. Paula, we're seeing some of these quite spectacular MRP polls, which you're going to very rapidly explain to everybody, which show vast numbers of seats going to Reform and Conservatives, Labour going to incredibly small numbers of seats. Should we be paying any attention to that at this stage in a parliament? And do you think there's any prospects that we might see an emerging view of what we might call the sort of historic parties, that maybe we do need to reconsider the case for electoral reform? Reform, of course, used to be very pro-electoral reform, and I think they've slightly changed their mind on it now as potential beneficiaries of first past the post. So what do you reckon, Paula?
Cynic.
I am very cynical. I'm going to be cynical too.
No one's ever in favour of electoral reform while they're winning, are they? Let's start off with the MRPs. So these are, I'm not going to do my spiel about MRPs. There's a really good piece you can read on the UKICE website if you want to know more about MRPs. Are they any use to anybody at this stage in the Parliament? No. Spend your money on something else. Do something more useful and stop producing these polls, because they're not magic. I do think sometimes that the kind of wider political commentariat think that the M stands for magic, but they're not magic. They depend heavily on the polling input that goes into them. So if Reform are 15-16% ahead in your poll, you're going to get a massive majority for them. You don't need an MRP to tell you that. I'll tell you that a lot cheaper. So you don't need the MRP. And at this point in an electoral cycle, they are of relatively limited use. People aren't really thinking about how they will vote in 3 years' time. We saw huge levels of tactical voting at the last election. People making those decisions have not made their minds up yet. They don't know what the tactical situation how they will feel about the parties, what the tactical situation will be in 3 years' time. So I don't think they're very, very useful. At this point, in the 2019 to 2024 Parliament, I believe the Conservative Party was still building literally a unique stage for Boris Johnson to appear on. And we know how we ended up in 2024. So I think it's too early to be making those kinds of calls. On the electoral system, as I said, nobody's in favour of electoral reform while they're winning. I thought it was something that Reform would go much harder on after the election in terms of trying to make it a big issue. It's faded away as they've risen up the polling. You can read into that what you will.
Okay, I'm going to come with a final question to you all. Let's cast forward to 2028, when we probably will be at party conference season and know there'll be an election coming the following year. Do we expect to see lots of people at the Conservative Party conference all clustering around people who may be about to take government, and people thinking, Reform Party conference not where it's at? Or do we expect Reform to be booking out giant conference centres and having massive numbers of fringes, things like that, and people organising maybe a token event or two at the Conservatives, and businesses, there'll only be the guide dogs left in the hall coming, to the Conservatives? What do we reckon? Tim Bale, what do you reckon? You'll be selling off remaindered copies of your Conservative books.
I'm already doing that, I assume. I would have thought what we'll be seeing and hearing is a lot of speculation about some kind of deal between Reform and the Conservatives. I understand what Tim says about Nigel Farage, but as we know, Nigel Farage will continue to deny any kind of deal as in 2019 before he does one. And likewise, I suggest that whoever is the new leader of the Conservative Party after Kemi Badenoch will probably be interested in a deal as well.
Tim Montgomery, what do you think? What's your forward casting?
Well, I said that Donald Trump would never become president of the United States. Jeremy Corbyn would never become Labour leader. And Brexit wouldn't happen. David Cameron wouldn't win the 2015 election. So I'm not very good at predictions. What I'll say is only this, because I really think it is almost a fool's game to try and predict what's going to happen. I think the two-party system does look to me to be very broken. Very broken. I think the big thing that is happening, and why I think this will persist rather than other things that may change, is, we've already alluded to it, the same thing is happening on the continent. The two main parties of right and left that used to dominate the continent, they're all, then in every single country, they are fading badly. And so we could have the most unpredictable general election of modern times, because you could easily have 5-party politics, in Scotland 6-party politics, in Wales 6-party politics. For those of us who watch politics as well as are involved in it, it's going to be absolutely fascinating. And it's going to really test, I think, voters' faith in democracy, because you can easily see, this is back to the question on electoral reform, you could easily see parties winning seats on 25, 30% of the vote, and not necessarily the first choice or the second choice or the third choice of a lot of people. So our electoral system and our faith in politics is going to be tested, I think, like it's never been tested before. That's the only prediction I will make. People
were taking bets last night at the dinner I went to about whether anyone could win a seat with under 20% of the vote, because splits could be so much. Paula, final word, how different will the electoral landscape look by 2028?
Final word, given Tim has just set out his record of predictions, I suppose my best bet is to predict the opposite of what Tim has said.
that would be wise.
I think given that electoral system, that electoral landscape looks quite likely, highly fragmented, lots of parties in lots of places winning on small electoral votes, I will win back some MRP friends by saying that is when you need an MRP. That is when we should be looking at them.
Okay, that's a great point to end. So I'm going to thank my panel. Thanks to Tim and Paula. And please go back to the UK Changing Europe website. As Paula said, we've got lots of very useful material explaining us on polling and things like that. Lots of great analysis. So go back there, and thanks to everybody. And thank you very much for all your questions, and many apologies for those I